Oh man, that's a big sound, a big way to bring in the new week. A Shavua Tov to you, my holy sisters and brothers, a good vach. Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us on this fine Saturday night? Gwen Strong with us from Michigan. Melissa Itel Jurin says shalom and good evening from Great Neck, New York. Pauline Michael Shavua Tov from Arkansas. Kathleen Pepe Southern wishes us a good week. Rebecca May is with us from Arizona. Christo Cheney says Shavua Tov from Lubbock, Texas. John Latata, shalom from Alberta, Canada. Bill Eldridge, still in Arkansas. Sounds like this is going to be a highly applicable daf, regardless of one's religious tradition. Looking forward to it. Kathy Tilley is with us. Sue Strauss in the house from Chicago. Donna Smith says good Shabbos from Bahama, North Carolina. Dwebby Schweigart says shalom from Barnegat, New Jersey. Bryna, you got to let me know. Bloomfield says Shavua Tov from Sharon, Massachusetts. Rochelle Rosen says Shavua Tov. Stephanie Maria Diaz says Shavua Tov. Guy Thomas Kennedy from Dayton, Ohio. Nancy Brundemule Wright from Southern Pines, North Carolina. Harold Black is with Loretta in Oregon. Susanna Rose is with us from Sonoma, and Marcy Marceau is checking in from Montana. It's great to be with you. Where are we? We are on Daf Vav. That's page 6 of Tractate Eruvin, the third volume of the Talmud. We have been discussing how to adjust a three-sided alley so that we can carry an object there on Shabbos, so that it's permitted to carry, because on Shabbos, it is prohibited to carry in a public domain more than 4 cubits, or to carry out from a private domain into a public domain, or from a public domain to carry into a private domain. But this alley is this kind of unusual area. As we've seen, it's well, we're going to get to that in 1 second. But yes, exactly. Yesterday, we defined what an alleyway is. An alleyway, as the sages understand it, is there was a kind of a typical living situation where there were courtyards, that each courtyard had at least 2 homes in it, and there was an alley that at least 2 of these courtyards with multiple homes in it opened into the alley, and then the alley would lead out to the public thoroughfare. We've been discussing a 3-sided alley, meaning an alley that has walls around it with entrances to these courtyards, but only one opening to the alley, which leads out to the public thoroughfare. Now, hold on a second. Yes, and so yesterday we defined that alleyway, and we learned how long an alleyway has to be. And we saw that when we're going to tunnel under, we're going to lower the ground of the alleyway because there was a crossbeam over the alleyway. The general rule, as we've seen, is for one of these three-sided alleys, to render it permissible to carry there on Shabbos, we have to either put a crossbeam over the opening where it meets the public thoroughfare or a side post at either end. When we had this rare situation where it's a low crossbeam and the minimum height is 10 handbreadths off the ground, we saw, and we couldn't, and it was very low, and we couldn't raise it for some reason. We were going to lower the ground. Then how far do we extend that lowered ground? How much do we have to dig out of the alleyway? We saw we have to go at least 4 cubits, and that's the minimum length to be considered an alleyway. Pardon me. Okay. So now what we're talking about, and then we examine how wide a breach can be in the side of the alley. Right, so in the side of the alley, we saw that if a breach was as long as 10 cubits, it's still going to remain an alley. In other words, 10 cubits is the widest that an entranceway could be considered. So if there was a breach in the side of this alley, okay, so then we just consider it an entrance to what's on the other side of that wall, like a courtyard, right? These are courtyards that open into the alley. So if part of the walls of on the side of the alley fell down, but it was no more than 10 cubits wide, so it's just like another entrance into that courtyard that's on the other side of the wall. Okay, today, yes, so hold on a second. Now we're going to look at some conditions of these side breaches, corner breaches, and what happens when we have a two-sided rather than a three-sided alley. So the first question is, why do we permit a breach as wide as 10 cubits in the side of the wall? As we just said, it's because that defines an entrance. If it's wider than 10 cubits in the side, so it's like we don't have that three-sided alley anymore. Something happened, the wall fell down. This isn't an alleyway. It doesn't meet the requirements of an alleyway anymore. And so even if we did the correct thing at the opening of the alleyway out onto the public thoroughfare, we had the crossbeam above or the side post on the side, because so much of the side wall has fallen, more than just an entranceway to one of those courtyards on the side, now this thing is some other kind of space, and it is no longer possible to carry there on Shabbos. So that's on the side wall. Now we also saw that where the opening is to the public thoroughfare, that can be very wide. And we saw that the side post, sometimes it's not just a side post, sometimes it's like another wall made out of wooden boards perhaps, that extends out across the opening of the public thoroughfare. What if we have that kind of a situation where the side post is more of a small wall and there's a hole in that wall, there's a breach in that wall? Is it now going to is it going to change how we analyze this? So one of the opinions is that as opposed to a breach in the side of the alleyway, the Gemara says that if the breach is in that front wall along the opening where the alley meets the public thoroughfare, now only 4 handbreadths is going to be enough to invalidate it, because now we've got a situation that we don't quite understand. It's like there's 2 entrances there. There's the entrance to the alley that was defined by the side post, but then the side post itself was wide, and now there's a breach in the middle of that, and this whole thing is a little bit too confusing, so it's going to be rendered no good. But then Rav Huna ben Rav Yehoshua says, no, you're misunderstanding this. He says when we talk about that an opening of just 4 handbreadths is going to invalidate, is going to create a breach that invalidates the alley and our ability to carry there, he's saying it's because it happens right at the corner. It's not a hole in that wide side post, or let's say that fence at the front of the alley, but rather it's right at the corner. So if the corner has been torn down with a width of 4 handbreadths or more, this is a problem, and it makes sense, right? We've said that this alley is defined by walls running down the length of the alley, the other end of the alley is a wall, and an opening onto the public thoroughfare. But if one of the corners right at the public thoroughfare has been destroyed, well, then that opening is not really an opening. It doesn't have the form of a doorway. It doesn't have a side post. It doesn't have a place where the crossbeam can be attached to. And so there's no way that this now is an alleyway that's been adjusted so that carrying can be permitted there, says Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua. And Rav Huna disagreed with, so now that he's explained himself this way, and so according to Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, what he's saying is if the breach is not in the corner, but it's just in that front board, so that's not going to matter. Right there, the rule is going to be the same as if the breach is in the side of the alley. It can be as much as 10 cubits wide. It's not going to invalidate. The key for him is that the corners are still standing and that really defines the alleyway, the corners where the alleyway meets the public thoroughfare. So now that he's explained himself that way, the Gemara is going to say, well, apparently Rav Huna disagreed with Rav Hanan bar Rava, who says that the breach in the front is like the one in the side. Wait a minute. I just said the wrong thing? Okay, yeah, so Rav Huna says that it must be that the... Hold on a second. Okay. And so they're going to say, well, he must have disagreed with Rav Hanan, the son of Rava. But Rav Hanan, the son of Rava, says, no. You're misunderstanding this whole thing. Hold on a second. Let me just get this straight in my notes. This is why we say that Eruvin is complicated and we got to get it right. So let me just take a moment. Okay. Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, actually we're talking about a breach in the corner, so there's no doorpost. Therefore, a breach in the front has the same requirements as a breach in the side. Right, okay. And Rav Huna disagreed with Rav Hanan bar Rava, who says that a breach in front is like a breach in the side. So that would seem like they have the same opinion. So I made a mistake. Let's just go on. The key is going to be, for sure, the corners have to be intact. Now, Rav Huna says, and Rav Huna says, look, it is this way, that the breach in the side can only be 10 cubits wide. And I know that because Rav went to Nehardea and he ruled just like I'm saying. And Rav Hanan bar Rava said, that's no proof because Rav went to this place and was overly stringent. Why? Because he found an unguarded valley and fenced it in. See, the reason we're having some confusion here is because Rav issued a ruling when he went to this community in Nehardea that was more stringent than what he would normally require. Why? Because the people there were totally ignorant, were violating the law right and left, and he passed a ruling which was more stringent than would be necessary in a place like Nehardea, where there was a large and active and educated Jewish community, where Shmuel was actually the leader. But there, in that other place, he had to be a little bit extra, right? A little bit extra stringent so that the people wouldn't blow it. They needed a bigger fence around the Torah, as it were, because they knew so little. And even after he set them up properly, if he just left them there, then a couple of years later, he could come back and the people would be straying all over the place. So extra stringency was required in that situation. Okay, to help us understand the law of a breach in the side, and so we're talking about, it seems that everyone agrees that a breach in the side wall of this three-sided alley can be as wide as 10 cubits, and it doesn't render the alley invalid because it's like an entrance. Okay, but is that exactly true? So to help us understand the law of a breach in the side wall, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak is going to bring in the law of an L-shaped alley. So we get a sense of what that looks like. Here we go. So we're looking at an alley like that, right? So there's a public thoroughfare on two sides, and then this alley goes inside, and it has a corner. So it surrounds sort of like that corner lot, that courtyard. And then there's other courtyards around the alley, but the alley itself forms an L shape. So this L-shaped alley, what is it? Is it a two-sided alley that makes a turn in the middle, but is actually one alley with two openings, right? It's a two-sided alley that opens onto two different public thoroughfares. Or is this more like one alley that has a breach in the sidewall that happens to lead to another thoroughfare? That's what the sages are trying to work out in this analysis, as it were. Okay, so now, how do you correct a two-sided alley? We've been talking about how you adjust a three-sided alley so that you can carry there on Shabbos. A two-sided alley, so like a simple image of that would be like this. Okay, so that's a two-sided alley. Whoa. Everything is backwards when I hold it up to the camera. So this one, okay, so there you go. That's a two-sided alley that connects two public thoroughfares. Now, the two-sided alley is definitely going to need more in the way of legal and symbolic adjustment, because this alley isn't going to be of service only to the people who live in those courtyards that exit their homes and their courtyards and go through that alley out to the public thoroughfare. Once you've got an alley that connects two public thoroughfares, you know people are going to use that alley as a shortcut. So now we need a little bit more to make this a place where people can carry. So rather than just require one crossbeam over the top or a side post at both ends, for example, right? In the three-sided alley, there's only one end of the alley, and so a crossbeam on top or a side post at the side in the front, right at that opening, is enough to make it permissible to carry there on Shabbos. But with the two-sided alley, we're going to have different requirements on the two ends. It doesn't matter which end is which, but one end is going to have more than just a crossbeam or a side post. One end of that alley is going to be turned into a symbolic closure. It's going to be the form of a doorway. What is the form of a doorway? That means two side posts and a crossbeam, not just one side post or a crossbeam, rather two side posts and a crossbeam. All three elements are going to be required at one end of that alley. And so symbolically, that end of the alley is now closed. And then the other end of the alley can be like a regular three-sided alley, either the crossbeam or the post. That's what we do with a two-sided alley. So now we're talking about this L-shaped alley, right? That it also has two openings, one at either end to go to a public thoroughfare, but it also has this angle in the middle, right? This corner of the L-shaped alley. So Rav says for an L-shaped alley, we have to do even more. Now what we need is that at the ends where it meets the public thoroughfare, you can put either the post or the crossbeam. But at the angle, you have to make the form of a doorway. So it's going to close, essentially act like a closure in both directions. It's like two alleys meet in the middle, right? The two-sided alley was just one alley with two ends. According to Rav, this L-shaped alley is two-sided alleys that happen to meet at one point. So you need to make the form of a doorway where the two alleys meet, and then you could do the crossbeam or side post at the openings out to the public thoroughfare. Alternatively, since they are two-sided alleys, you could put the form of a doorway at the openings where they meet the public thoroughfare, and at the angle where the two alleys meet, you could there just have a side post or a crossbeam. Shmuel is going to disagree. He's going to say that the L-shaped alley is more like a three-sided alley, and all you have to do is put the crossbeam or the side post at the ends. It's like he's saying what we were saying before, that an L-shaped alley is really like, from the point of view of either alley, it's just a three-sided alley that happens to have an opening in the side, a breach in the side wall that acts as an entrance and leads in another direction. But each to the other is just acting as a breach in the side wall, and therefore all you need is they're two different. According to him, really what they are is two three-sided alleys, and that's why just a side post or crossbeam at the openings to the public thoroughfare is enough. according to Shmuel. But the law, the halacha, is like Rav. We need more of an adjustment. We're going to have the form of the doorway either at the corner or at the ends. And that's generally true, that in disputes between Rav and Shmuel, the law follows Rav. Okay. Now, the sages are going to bring a related case. They're going to bring down a baraisa, which is about this, these are from the same contemporaneous period as the Mishnas, but not as authoritative as a Mishnah. So a baraisa are the teachings of the Tanaim, right, prior to the closure of the Mishnah in the year 200, approximately year 200. So the sages will look at a baraisa and ask, can we create a zone where we can carry on Shabbos, not in an alleyway, not in a private domain, but in the public thoroughfare? Is there a way to adjust a public thoroughfare so that we can carry there? Now, these alleyways are not public thoroughfares. Why? Because they're not at least 16 cubits wide. That's a minimum requirement for a public thoroughfare. And some say that it's a thoroughfare that potentially 600,000 people walk through there, right? That truly a public place. So how would you take a public street, a big, busy public street, and turn it into a zone where we can carry on Shabbos? So Beis Shammai, the followers of Shammai, say the only way to do that is to close it off on both ends. And essentially you would need a wall on both ends, but that wall either has a door in the wall or is a door. Like it just like the whole end is a door. I don't think you would have a door 16 cubits wide. So what he's essentially saying is you'd have a wall at two ends, in this zone of the public thoroughfare that you want to block off, and there have to be doors since you're going to keep walking through it. So there have to be doors there. And according to Beis Shammai, you need doors at both ends of this zone in the public thoroughfare that you want to turn into a place that you can carry on Shabbos. Beis Hillel say you only need a door in one end, and at the other end, you can essentially use a side post or a crossbeam. And now that we're talking about public thoroughfares where you can carry on Shabbos, and that all you really need is one door. So now we get the example that Rabbi Bar Chana brings down of Jerusalem. Right? So if you've ever been to Jerusalem and you went to visit the old city, so you see that the old city is a walled city. It's a city that has walls all the way around it. There's a few different gates and openings, but even if there was only one opening, the fact that those doors can be closed. The fact that in the old times, the city walls, right, there was the city gates of a walled city, and the city gates would be closed at night. People cannot enter or leave the city at night. Because you could close a door in this whole walled city, so then on Shabbos, you can carry anywhere inside that walled city because there is a door that limits access to that whole area. And Ula said the same thing about the walled city of Mechoza. Because it has a door that you can open and close, that is a place where you can carry. Now, does the door have to actually be closed for you to carry there? No, it's enough that it has the possibility of being closed. So these are not symbolic doorways, but actual doorways, right? When we've been talking about the form of a doorway allowing us to carry in an alley, that's because it's an alley and not a public thoroughfare. With a public thoroughfare, we're going to need an actual door to turn it into a place where we can carry. So Rav Yehuda says, okay, a two-sided alley, the form of the doorway at one end, and the side post or crossbeam at the other end, that's going to be enough to make it possible to carry there, as we've already discussed. But for the public thoroughfare, which is wider and more traveled, it's not enough. Now, with regard to the public domain, we need the actual door, but it need not be locked, as we just said, just capable of being locked. But then the example is brought of the city of Nehardea, that's in Babylonia, and there were doors, there were actual doors to this area, but the doors were buried in the sand. They were never closed, right? They were actual doors that could be closed, But because nobody ever bothered to close them, the sand piled up on these doors and made it so that you couldn't open and close the doors. So now that the doors are not capable of being closed, does that mean that this whole walled-in enclosure is no longer, we're not allowed to carry there on Shabbos? And indeed, when Rav Nachman came there, he had the doors dug out. He said, no, you have doors, but since they're frozen because they're half buried in sand, you can no longer say that these doors are capable of closing. And even though they're not closed, they could be closed because they can't be closed. They're buried in sand. So he had them dug out. And so we see the doors have to be capable of being closed. Then we learn about this other alleyway in Nehardea, this one alley in Nehardea, which for some reason it says they applied the stringencies of Rav and the stringencies of Shmuel. So now we're getting to the title of today's episode. Can we go opinion shopping among rabbis? And as Bill Eldridge said at the top, this probably applies not just to Jews and rabbis, but to anyone, right? If you're not getting the answer you want from your spiritual advisor, should you go looking for another spiritual advisor to get the answer that you're looking for, right? Usually we're looking for leniencies. So what is this situation? Is it an L-shaped alley? Well, we already see with the L-shaped alley, all we need is the form of a doorway, either in the corner or at the ends, and then a side post or beam in the other location. That's according to Rav. Okay. But so what are we talking about that they put in the stringencies of both? So it turns out this is not just an L-shaped alley, it's a U-shaped alley. It's a U-shaped alley, right? Rav said that an L-shaped alley is like two-sided alleys, and we saw how you adjust that. And Shmuel said that an L-shaped alley is like an alley that has a breach in the side from whichever direction you look at it. But this was a U-shaped alley. Okay, it's a U-shaped alley, and I think we have a picture like that. Okay, so here we go. It's a U-shaped alley right there. And as you can see, they put these doorways, these doors, not the forms of doors, but actual doors in the corners. So why would they need to put two actual doors in this sort of three-legged alley, a U-shaped alley that has two corners, not just one? And why would it now need actual doorways in there, right? Why? So this was a U-shaped alley, and it's stringent like Rav in saying that this is a two-sided alley. This is going to act like a two-sided alley. And it's stringent like Shmuel, who apparently likened this particular alley to a public thoroughfare rather than the kind of alleys that we've been talking about. It's a little bit unclear why this is a stringency of Shmuel, since Shmuel was already more lenient than Rav when it came to L-shaped alleys, right? Shmuel was already a little bit more lenient than Rav in the L-shaped alley. So why is it that there's going to be a stringency here, that this is like two L-shaped alleys coming together, that this is going to require doors, that this is going to be the stringencies of Rav and the stringencies of Shmuel? Why are we going to have double stringencies in this situation? And so here we see, let me just read it to you. The Gemara poses a question. But do we adopt the respective stringencies of two authorities who disagree on a series of issues? Wasn't it taught in a baraisa that the halacha, the law, is always in accordance with the opinion of Beis Hillel, the followers of Hillel? But one who wishes to act in accordance with the opinion of Beis Shammai may do so, and one who wishes to act in accordance with the opinion of Beis Hillel may do so. And if he wishes to adopt both the leniencies of Beis Shammai and the leniencies of Beis Hillel, he is a wicked person. And if he wishes to adopt both the stringencies of Beis Shammai and the stringencies of Beis Hillel, about this person, the verse states in Ecclesiastes, the fool walks in darkness. The fool walks in darkness. So according to this, If you adopt the leniencies of two authorities who disagree with each other, then you're wicked. If you adopt the stringencies of two authorities who disagree with each other, you're a fool. Rather, how should he act? He should act either in accordance with Beis Shammai, following both their leniencies and their stringencies, or in accordance with Beis Hillel, following both their leniencies and their stringencies. But then right away the Gemara objects to this analysis, because what does this mean? It opens by saying that the law always follows Beis Hillel in disputes with Beis Shammai. So if the law follows Beis Hillel, why is that a person is permitted to follow Beis Shammai? He should follow Beis Shammai in all their leniencies and their stringencies, but why doesn't, but the law follows Beis Hillel, so a person should always follow Beis Hillel. So that to understand how this situation is possible, there's a few explanations given. The first is, well, no, this is a teaching that applied before we had this episode that we'll come to later in the Talmud, in fact, a week from now. And let me just mention now that we're going to have guest rabbis teaching from tomorrow, Sunday, through Friday, because I'm going on vacation. You're going to love Rav Aaron Parry, who's teaching tomorrow for 3 days, and then starting on Wednesday. So Rabbi Parry is going to do Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, and then Rabbi Abish Rand is going to teach Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And then I'm going to be back, and I'll be back with you a week from tonight, Saturday night, God willing. And then I'll be teaching what this is referring to, this famous incident on Eruvin, page 13, in which we get the call from heaven in matters, in disputes between the Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. The law follows Beis Hillel. And I'll explain a week from now why that is. But it's an actual voice from heaven that comes and tells the people, no, you must follow Beis Hillel. And the voice from heaven explains why as well. We'll get to that in a week. But what is being said here is, well, until the voice from heaven said that the law always follows Beis Hillel, so then people could choose. You know, you could be a religious observant Jew, but you could be in the Beis Hillel camp, or you could be in the Beis Shammai camp. It's up to you to choose which camp you're in. Both are valid. You're not a wicked person. You're not doing anything wrong, even though they disagree with each other. Both are legitimate ways to practice Judaism. But what you can't do is cherry pick what's easier from Beis Hillel and what's easier from Beis Shammai. And you can't even cherry pick what's more challenging from Beis Hillel and what's more challenging from Beis Shammai. You got to be in one camp or the other. That's one way to understand how we reconcile this teaching of pick one or the other with the other teaching that the law always follows Beis Hillel. Another way to reconcile these two teachings, pick one or the other, but the law always follows Beis Hillel, is according to the teaching of Rabbi Yehoshua. Because Rabbi Yehoshua said, we don't listen to voices from heaven. Let that sink in for a second. Now he teaches that in another super famous, maybe the most famous story in the Talmud, and we'll get to that several years from now when we're in Bava Metzia. But in that story, there was a big dispute between sort of all the sages and Rabbi Eliezer. It was like the whole group against one, but the one, Rabbi Eliezer, was right. He was right, they were all wrong. And a voice from heaven came down and said, well, no, Rabbi Eliezer is right. And the other rabbi said to heaven, we don't listen to voices from heaven. How could have so much chutzpah to say something like that? Well, he was right. His point was, Rabbi Yehoshua's point was, you gave us a Torah. You told us to follow the law. We know, and you know, that God doesn't always tell us what the law is, right? In fact, God is mostly silent, and we have to figure it out for ourselves, and we have to listen to our sages. So in every generation, according to the Torah, we have our elders, the sages, and we have to listen to them. They tell us how to follow the law. So we're following your system. don't now interfere with a voice from heaven and tell us, and get involved as we're doing your system that you laid out for us. It was very chutzpahdik of Rabbi Yehoshua to say that, but God said, you're right, as we'll learn when we get to that story, and I think it's Bava Metzia. So that's much later. So that's another way to reconcile those two teachings. Pick one or the other, Beis Hillel or Beis Shammai, and the law always follows Beis Hillel. And the final way to reconcile those two teachings is that, well, you may be the law may always follow Beis Hillel, but there's some areas where the law is unclear, and a sage in your generation may be drawing information from Beis Shammai or Beis Hillel, where it's not that he's failing to follow the teaching that the law always follows Beis Hillel, it's just he's basing his analysis on something that Beis Shammai said, and somebody else is basing his analysis on something that Beis Hillel said. But these are the guys who are making rulings. They're just getting, sort of source information or sources of analysis from those two earlier schools. In any case, the teaching is definitely valid that we do not go opinion shopping. And this is why we're told in Pirkei Avos that really you should have a rabbi. You need to have a rabbi, not just a rabbi, but a rav. Somebody that you can go and ask questions of, and that's going to be your person. You're going to get your answers from that rav. Now, sometimes that your rav is not available, and you're going to go ask a question from somebody else. But wherever you go to get an answer to your halakhic question, okay, you entrusted that rabbi to be your rabbi and give you the ruling. Once he gives you the ruling, if you don't like it, you don't go, oh, yeah, I don't like that. I'm going to go talk to some other rabbi and see if I can get a different ruling that is more convenient and practicable for me. We learned from this page, Daf Vav, page 6 in Tractate Eruvin, that we don't do that. We don't go opinion shopping among rabbis. Okay, that's what I've got for us tonight. Let me see if we've got questions or comments. Gwen Strong, what happens if we put up double doors that are 6 feet tall at the entrance to the alley from the public domain? Is that allowed? Well, so it's not a question of is it allowed. You're allowed to put up doors. You could do anything you need. The question is that going to make it permissible for carrying there? Doors, if we're talking about a 3-sided alley, it's overkill. We don't need doors. All we need is the side post or the crossbeam. But if we go the extra distance and put those doors, it's going to work. In fact, it's really going to close it. It's like when the doors are closed, now this isn't even an alleyway anymore, a 3-sided alley. Now it's a 4-sided courtyard. We essentially turned the alley into a courtyard, and for sure we can carry there. That's what we learned yesterday when we close off that end of the alley. If we're talking about a 2-sided alley, and now we need a form of a doorway, right? So the 2 side posts and the beam. If we go the whole hog and put actual doors there, again, so it's like when the doors are closed, it's acting like a 3-sided alley. Even when they're open, it's like we definitely have the form of a doorway. So good question, Gwen, and it's going to work. And Lynn in Texas says, at the end of the daf, a heavenly voice to follow Beit Hillel is mentioned as made mandatory. So why do so here, but not honor the heavenly voice for upholding Rabbi Eliezer in an earlier story, right? So that, as I was mentioning, and I mean, it's amazing, right? It's amazing that the rabbis, would challenge, like when we say that they heard a bas kol, right? It's called a bas kol, a heavenly voice. The real translation is the daughter of a voice, right? So it's very interesting language. It's the daughter of a voice. But what it means is it's the voice from heaven, right? We don't say it's the voice of God, so it's more like God sent a voice, right? It's almost like God sent an audio angel. Maybe that's a better way to look at it. But it's from God. It's coming from God. And in that other story, the ending of it is that the rabbi said, we don't listen to heavenly voices because we can't rely on heavenly voices to speak up and tell us what to do. That we had many disputes among us sages, and usually there's no heavenly voice getting involved, right? And so Rabbi Yehoshua said, so we believe that it's not about heavenly voices. It's about the process of the oral tradition that you, Hashem, that you, God, gave us. So he said, we don't listen to heavenly voices. Now, if at that moment the teaching was, no, you listen to heavenly voices, then since God was already involved in that argument, he would have let them know that, no, you listen to heavenly voices. But when Rabbi Yehoshua challenged God at that time, God backed off. God actually backed off. And then the coda of that story, the epilogue of that story, is that at that time, like many years later, I forget exactly, but some rabbi runs into Elijah. So Elijah, the prophet Elijah, is a character that in rabbinic literature, lived, was a prophet, died, went to heaven, but he comes back from time to time as a messenger. And in fact, it will be the prophet Elijah who comes back to announce the coming of the Messiah when the Messiah comes. But sometimes Elijah appears to people, especially to the rabbis here and there, sometimes walking on the road, sometimes even in the marketplace. And so a rabbi merited to have a visit from Elijah. And he knew he was talking to Elijah. And he said, well, at the time that the rabbis were arguing with Eliezer and challenged God and said, we don't listen to a bas kol, we don't listen to a heavenly voice because you told us we need to work it out for ourselves. And by the way, this is one of the first examples of democracy and meritocracy in human history, right? The rabbis were exerting their authority on the population by a meritocracy of people who qualified to be sages, and among the sages, they voted, right? So it was the result of a vote, and it was because all these other sages outvoted Eliezer that the law was going to be according to them. So when this later rabbi said to the prophet Elijah, when the sages outvoted Eliezer and said to God, we don't listen to heavenly voices, what was God's reaction? What was God's reaction? And Elijah reported to the rabbi, at that moment, God laughed. In other words, he laughed with pride. And he said, ha, 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 my children have defeated me. In other words, right? In other words, you want to raise, as a parent, we want to raise children who are strong-minded and independent and are capable of arriving at decisions without us telling them what to do at every turn, right? We don't want to be helicopter parents who remain helicopter parents throughout the lives of our kids. We want them to be able to be independent minds that can work out problems for themselves. And God said at that moment he was proud of his children, that they had figured it out. And that's why God backed off from this situation and allowed their ruling to stand. It ends up being a pretty sad story because Rabbi Eliezer, who was right, because he knew he was right, he couldn't accept the ruling. And so he kept challenging them, and ultimately they excommunicated him. And the greatest of all the sages in his generation ended up ostracized. It was very, very painful. And his brother-in-law was the chief rabbi, was the Nasi, the head of the Sanhedrin, the chief of all the rabbis. And it was like, and Eliezer was married to the sister of the chief rabbi. It was just an awful situation. It was painful all around. Rabbi Akiva would visit Eliezer, but he couldn't really learn with him because of this excommunication. It was a painful episode, but a tremendous and unforgettable story that I look forward to us learning together when we get there. Final comment, Bill says, have a wonderful vacation. We promise not to behave like kids with a substitute teacher while you're gone. Please be respectful. Please ask them questions, but I'm sure you're going to enjoy Rabbi Parry and Rabbi Rand's teachings. All the best, my holy brothers and sisters.